The diamond necklace I had worn for 20 years didn't just break. My husband unlatched it from my neck while I was still holding my birthday champagne. "Don't stretch the gold, Martha. It belongs to someone with a firmer, younger neck now," Victor sneered. His voice was cold, like a winter wind cutting through the warm air of our dining room. He didn't just want a divorce, he wanted to destroy me on the very hour I turned 65. He dropped a thick, heavy envelope of divorce papers onto my lap, right next to my birthday cake. He told me I was expired, a relic he was trading in for a newer model who hadn't yet learned how to frown or show her age. I didn't cry. I didn't scream or throw the glass in my hand. I just looked at the man I had built an empire for, a man I had supported for 4 decades. I smiled a slow, calm smile that seemed to confuse him. I leaned forward and whispered, "I hope you've enjoyed the luxury, Victor. Because as of right now, you're officially trespassing in this house." He laughed, thinking I was joking, but his laughter sounded thin and nervous. He had no idea that while he was planning his exit, I had already rewritten the ending to his story. My name is Martha Vance. To the world, I was the quiet, supportive wife of Victor Vance, the construction tycoon. But the world has a very short memory. If you look back 40 years, you won't find Victor's name on any prestigious engineering awards. You will find mine. I was the one who graduated top of my class. I was the one with the architectural vision. When we met, Victor was a charming salesman with big dreams and empty pockets. I was the daughter of a brilliant engineer who left me a mountain of patents and a very specific family trust. I chose to stay in the shadows, letting Victor take the credit so he could feel like the man he wanted to be. I thought our love was the foundation of our success. I thought we were a team. For nearly all of those 40 years, I managed the back end of the business, the legal work and the intellectual property that kept our company afloat. Victor became the face of the brand, getting addicted to the cameras and the praise. He started believing his own lies. He began to think that he was the genius and I was just the aging woman who cooked his dinners and managed his calendar. He forgot where the money actually came from. The last 10 years have been a slow, painful slide into being invisible. It didn't happen all at once. It started with him coming home later and later. Then, he stopped asking me about my day. He stopped looking me in the eye when we spoke. When we went to gala events, he would walk 3 steps ahead of me, as if he were ashamed to be seen with a woman who actually looked her age. He started making jokes about my gray hair and the tiny lines around my eyes. He called them reminders of the past while he looked toward the future. I became a ghost in my own hallways. I would sit in the library, surrounded by the books and blueprints that built our wealth, and he would walk right past me without a word. He treated me like a piece of furniture that had gone out of style, something to be replaced when the fabric started to wear thin. I realized then that my loyalty meant nothing to him. He didn't see a partner. He saw an appliance that was nearing its warranty date. The man I loved was gone, replaced by a hollow shell of vanity and greed. But while he was busy ignoring me, I was busy watching him. I saw every mistake he made. 6 months before this disastrous birthday, I found the first real crack in his secret life. I was organizing the mail when I found a receipt for a luxury penthouse in the city center. We lived in a sprawling estate in the suburbs, so there was no reason for us to own a city apartment. Then I found the jewelry receipts. Not for the necklace he just took off my neck, but for expensive bracelets and designer handbags that never made it into my closet. I hired a private investigator, not because I wanted to save my marriage, but because I needed to know how much of our joint money he was stealing. The report came back with pictures of a 25-year-old fitness instructor named Sabrina. Victor wasn't just having an affair, he was building a whole new life, using my family's money. He was quietly siphoning our money into a secret account to fund her lifestyle. He thought he was being clever, moving money in small increments. He didn't realize that I am an engineer by trade. I notice when the structural integrity of a bridge is failing, and I certainly noticed when the structural integrity of my bank accounts began to leak. He thought I was a tech-illiterate housewife. He was very wrong. I am not going to pretend I was fearless every night of those 6 months. There was one evening, a Wednesday in October when the house felt like it was made of silence, that I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cold cabinet and cried until I couldn't breathe. Not because I missed Victor. I had stopped missing the real Victor long ago. I cried for the version of him I had spent 40 years believing in. The man I had convinced myself he was becoming. I picked up my phone and held it in both hands. His name was right there on the screen. My thumb hovered over it for almost a full minute. I wanted to call him. I wanted to scream at him, demand he look me in the eye and explain how he could discard 40 years like an expired receipt. I wanted him to feel something. But I put the phone down on the cold tile, because I realized that calling him would mean giving him the one thing I had resolved never to surrender. My pain. He didn't deserve to witness it. I sat there a little longer. Then I wiped my face on a dish towel, stood up and went back to the blueprints spread across the kitchen table. The next morning, I called Mr. Henderson. Instead of screaming at Victor when I found out the full extent of his theft, I had gone to see my family's old attorney. Mr. Henderson had served my father for 50 years, and he looked at the evidence with a grim expression. What we found was a golden opportunity. Because Victor had been so desperate to grow the business quickly in the early days, he had borrowed against my father's patents to fund every major deal he ever made. He had signed papers he hadn't fully read. Those papers said that if Victor was ever caught stealing from the company, the patents came straight back to me. Even better, the house we lived in wasn't owned by the company or by Victor. It was owned by a private family trust that my father set up before he died. Victor was a guest in my home and an employee in my company, though he didn't know it yet. Henderson also retrieved the prenuptial agreement we had signed at the very beginning of our marriage. Victor had signed it without truly reading it, too eager to get his hands on my father's money to question a single word. That agreement said one simple thing. Everything that came from my father's work was mine alone if we ever divorced. I spent those 6 months quietly moving pieces on a chessboard he couldn't even see. I was waiting for the perfect moment to checkmate him. I decided his behavior on my birthday would be the final deciding factor. Back at the birthday table, the air was thick with Victor's arrogance. He looked at me with pity, as if I were a dog he was about to drop off at a shelter. "I hope you've enjoyed the luxury," I had said. He let out a loud, barking laugh. "Martha, look at you. You're confused. This is my house. This is my company. I'm giving you a generous settlement so you can go live in a nice little condo somewhere. You should be thanking me." He stood up and signaled to Sabrina, who was waiting in the hallway. She walked in wearing a dress that was far too short and a smirk that was far too wide. She looked at my birthday cake and wrinkled her nose. "Is that chocolate? It's so bad for the skin," she giggled. Victor put his arm around her waist, looking at me with total disdain. "I hope you saved your allowance, Martha," he said, echoing my own phrasing. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling a strange sense of peace. "Victor," I said calmly, "I hope you saved yours. Because as of 5 minutes ago, I revoked your access to all corporate accounts. I also took back my father's patents. Every single one. You aren't a tycoon anymore. You're just a man with a very expensive mistress and no way to pay for her." Victor's face went from smug to bright red in 3 seconds. "What are you talking about? You can't do that. I'm the CEO. He reached for his phone, probably to call his bank or his head of finance. I just watched him. I knew he wouldn't get through. I had already spoken to the board of directors. They weren't loyal to Victor. They were loyal to the patents that made the company money. When I showed them the proof of Victor's embezzlement for Sabrina's penthouse, they were more than happy to vote him out. Victor's hands started to shake as he realized his phone service had been cut off. I pulled a legal document from under my placemat. "This is a deed, Victor. My father's deed. This house belongs to the Vance Trust, of which I am the sole trustee. You have no legal right to be here." I looked at my watch. "I called the local security firm 10 minutes ago. They are standing at the end of the driveway. You and your friend have exactly 1 hour to pack what you can carry in 2 suitcases. Anything left behind will be donated to charity tomorrow morning." Sabrina's smirk vanished instantly. She looked at the giant chandelier, and then at Victor, her eyes filling with doubt. The next hour was the most satisfying 60 minutes of my life. I sat in the living room and watched through the open door as Victor scrambled. He was screaming at me, calling me every name in the book, but his voice sounded desperate. He went to his closet and started stuffing his designer suits into trash bags because he couldn't find enough suitcases. Sabrina was arguing with him, demanding to know why the limitless credit cards weren't working. She wasn't helping him pack, she was trying to save her own expensive shoes. The neighborhood was quiet, but I knew the neighbors were watching through their windows. They saw the titan of industry dragging garbage bags across the lawn. The security guards stood by the fountain, their arms crossed, looking professional and unmoved. When Victor tried to take the keys to the silver luxury car in the driveway, the head guard stepped forward. "I'm sorry, sir. That vehicle is registered to the corporation. You'll need to step away." Victor looked like he was going to have a heart attack. He had to call an Uber to pick him up from the mansion he thought he owned. Seeing him stand on the curb with his trash bags was my best birthday present. When the Uber finally pulled away, the silence that filled the house was beautiful. For years, the house had felt heavy with Victor's ego and his constant demands. Now, it just felt like a home again. I walked through the rooms, turning on all the lights. I went to the kitchen and cut myself a huge slice of that chocolate cake. It tasted like victory. And it wasn't lonely. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for 40 years, and finally, I could breathe. I looked at the spot on the wall where Victor's portrait used to hang. I had taken it down months ago and hidden it behind the boiler in the basement. I realized that my life wasn't ending at 65. It was finally starting on my own terms. I didn't need a man to tell me I was valuable. I knew my value. I spent the night in the master bedroom, stretching out across the entire bed. For the first time in a decade, I didn't have to listen to his snoring or his complaints about how I was aging. I fell asleep with a smile on my face, knowing that tomorrow would be the first day of the rest of my empire. The next morning, I didn't go to a spa or a luxury mall. I went to the office. I arrived at 8 a.m., wearing a sharp, tailored suit I hadn't worn in years. The lobby of the Vance Group was buzzing with rumors. When I walked toward the executive elevator, the receptionist looked surprised. "Mrs. Vance? Is everything okay?" I smiled and corrected her. "It's Ms. Vance now, and yes, everything is perfect." I headed straight for the boardroom. Victor had expected to walk in and take charge, but he was blocked at the security gate downstairs. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table. The board members arrived one by one, looking nervous. They had seen the news of the restructuring. I didn't waste time. I laid out the new engineering plans I'd been working on in secret. Plans for sustainable infrastructure that Victor had called boring and too expensive. I showed them that with the patents back in my control, the company's value was about to triple. I wasn't just the owner's wife anymore. I was the chairperson. By the time the meeting was over, they weren't just nodding, they were applauding. They realized that the brains of the operation had never left. She had just been waiting for the ego to get out of the way. While I was winning over the board, Victor was experiencing a very different kind of morning. He and Sabrina were holed up in a mid-range hotel because the penthouse was gone. He couldn't pay for it anymore. Victor had tried to pay for breakfast, but every single card was flagged. I had reported them stolen the night before, which was technically true. He had stolen that money from me. I heard later from the hotel staff that Sabrina started a screaming match in the lobby. She hadn't signed up for mid-range. She had signed up for yachts and private jets. The psychological honeymoon phase of their affair ended the moment the money stopped flowing. Victor tried to call his old friends, the men he played golf with and closed deals with. But those men weren't his friends. They were business associates. And business associates don't pick up the phone for a man who has been ousted from his own company and accused of embezzlement. Victor was starting to realize that without my money and my family name, he was just a 68-year-old man in a cheap hotel room with a woman who was already looking for the exit sign. His younger, better life was turning into a nightmare very quickly. A week later, Victor received another surprise. It wasn't just that he was broke, he was in deep legal trouble. While he was busy buying jewelry for Sabrina, He had been ignoring the company's tax filings. He thought he could just fix it later, with the money he was funneling away. I had spent months documenting every single financial irregularity. I handed it all over to the authorities. I wasn't being cruel. I was being thorough. He had put my father's legacy at risk to buy a mistress a sports car. I made sure the IRS knew exactly which accounts were his and which were mine. He was personally liable for millions in back taxes and penalties. He had spent so much time trying to make me feel small and old that he forgot to do the actual work of being a CEO. He had become lazy and entitled. He thought his charm would save him forever. But charm doesn't pay tax liens. He sat in his hotel room, surrounded by legal notices, realizing that the relic he had discarded was the only person who had ever kept him safe from his own stupidity. He was drowning, and he had no one to blame but himself. Then Victor landed a blow I had not anticipated. He had hired a new lawyer, sharper, hungrier than the first, and this one found a seam. He filed an emergency motion to freeze my personal cash accounts, claiming the money was jointly owned. It was a thin argument, but the judge didn't yet have the full picture, and he granted the temporary order. For 72 hours, I could not access a single dollar of my personal money. Not the trust, not the corporate accounts. Those were untouchable, and Victor knew it. But my personal cash, the money I used for groceries, for gas, for the small daily texture of life, was locked. I drove to Mr. Henderson's office and sat across from him with steadier hands than I felt. For the first time since my birthday, I was genuinely afraid. Not afraid of losing the war, but afraid of the thing I hadn't considered, that I might have been so focused on the large moves that I had left a small door open somewhere. I didn't sleep for 2 nights. I ate crackers at my desk and read every document again from the beginning. My handwriting shook a little when I signed our response filing. Henderson noticed. He put a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "Your father built this to last, Martha. Trust it." He was right. 72 hours later, the full documentation was placed before the court and the freeze dissolved completely. But those 3 days taught me something that all my preparation had not. The war wasn't finished just because I was winning. I decided to make my public comeback at the City Heritage Gala. It was the biggest event of the year, and normally, I stayed in the background while Victor gave a speech. This time, I went alone. I wore a stunning vintage gown that belonged to my mother, and I let my gray hair shine in a sophisticated style. I didn't try to look 25. I looked like a powerful 65-year-old woman. And for the first hour, the response was everything I had hoped for. People who used to ignore me were lining up to talk to me. They didn't want to know about Victor. They wanted to know about my new infrastructure project. I was announced as the chairperson of the Vance Group, and for the first time in my life, I felt the spotlight and didn't want to hide. Then I saw him. Victor had managed to obtain an invitation through a former business associate, and he had come prepared. He was moving through the room with purpose, pressing a thick, printed document into the hands of guests and journalists, a manufactured dossier, I would later learn, that alleged I had fraudulently orchestrated the corporate restructuring to steal assets that were rightfully his. I watched a reporter I recognized glance down at the first page. I watched 2 people near the bar step back from me slightly, suddenly unsure. For one long, cold moment, the floor tilted beneath my feet. I had prepared for many things. I had not prepared for him choosing my night of triumph as the battlefield. But Victor had made one final, fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that because he would strike in that moment, I would be undefended in that moment. He was wrong. Mr. Henderson and I had spoken about exactly this scenario weeks earlier. A sealed counter package, the full evidence, every document signed and certified, had already been sent to every journalist on the guest list 2 hours before the doors opened. The reporter with Victor's dossier in his hand already had the complete rebuttal in his inbox. I watched him check his phone. I watched Victor's face as he realized the room wasn't shifting. It was pivoting back. Within minutes, the whispers had reversed direction. Victor stood in the center of the ballroom, holding his own smear like a live grenade that had already been defused. Security escorted him out through a side door while I walked to the podium and gave my speech. I realized that Victor had been dimming my light for decades just so he could feel brighter. Without him, I was radiant. I walked through the ballroom with my head held high, shaking hands and making deals. I was no longer Victor's wife. I was Martha Vance, the woman who had reclaimed her empire. It was the most empowering night of my life, and I didn't miss him for a single second. As I was leaving the gala, Victor cornered me in the parking lot. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and his face was pale and sweaty. He tried to block my car door. "Martha, please," he begged. "We can talk about this. We've been together for 40 years. You can't just throw me out like garbage." He tried to use his old, charming voice, the one he used when he wanted a favor. He talked about the good old days and how we used to dream together. I looked at him, and for the first time I didn't feel anger. I felt nothing. He was like a stranger to me. "Victor," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You were the one who said I was expired. You were the one who brought another woman into our home on my birthday. You threw yourself out." He tried to grab my arm, but my security detail immediately stepped in. He looked shocked that I even had security. I didn't say another word. I got into my car and watched in the rearview mirror as he stood under the street lamp, looking smaller and smaller as I drove away. He was trying to manipulate a woman who no longer existed. That version of Martha died on her birthday. The divorce proceedings were a battle, but I was prepared for a war. Victor's lawyer opened with a small but real victory. He convinced a judge to force me to hand over 10 years of personal letters, financial records, and internal emails. It was invasive. It was exhausting. For 3 weeks, I sat in a conference room while his legal team leafed through decades of my private correspondence, searching for anything they could use. Victor attended every session. He sat across the long table from me with a small, satisfied smile. The smile of a man who believed he had finally found a way to make me feel exposed. He was wrong, but I let him enjoy it, because I knew what was coming. His lawyer then argued that Victor was entitled to half of my inheritance, claiming he had built the company with his own hands. My legal team just smiled. We produced the prenuptial agreement that Victor had signed 40 years ago when we were first married. The very document Mr. Henderson and I had unearthed during our preparations. He had completely forgotten it existed. The agreement was simple and absolute. Anything that came from my father's work remained entirely mine if we ever divorced. Victor sat across the table from me, his jaw dropping as the document was read aloud. The satisfied smile was gone. He had spent 40 years thinking he had outsmarted me, but I had the protection of my father's foresight. The judge looked at Victor with zero sympathy. The man who wanted someone younger was realizing that his older wife had legally armored herself before he even knew what a boardroom was. He left the courtroom with nothing but his personal debts. The news of Victor's downfall spread like wildfire. A local investigative reporter picked up the story of his embezzlement and the tax fraud. His face was all over the news, but not for the reasons he liked. He was the poster child for corporate greed and marital betrayal. His prestigious image was completely shattered. The men who used to invite him to exclusive clubs suddenly found their membership lists were full. He was toxic. Even the charities he used to donate to, with my money, returned his calls with polite rejections. He had spent his whole life building a brand based on being a winner. And now, he was the ultimate loser. I watched one of the news segments from my office, feeling a sense of justice. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the truth. He had spent so long pretending he was the hero of the story, but the world finally saw him as the villain he was. My reputation, meanwhile, was stronger than ever. I was seen as the resilient woman who had saved a company from a corrupt husband. The narrative had flipped, and there was nothing Victor could do to change it. Sabrina didn't stay long after the money dried up. I heard through the grapevine that she left Victor in the middle of the night. She didn't even leave a note. She just took the last of the cash he had hidden in a suitcase and disappeared. But the best part was the jewelry. She had taken all the expensive gifts Victor had given her to a high-end pawn shop, hoping to start a new life. The jeweler told her the truth. Every single piece was high-quality cubic zirconia. Victor had been so cheap and so desperate to look rich that he hadn't even bought her real diamonds. He had cheated on me with a woman he lied to, using fake stones to buy her affection. When I heard that, I laughed until I cried. It was the perfect irony. He had traded a diamond for a piece of glass. And in the end, they both ended up with nothing. Sabrina was gone, and Victor was left alone in that tiny hotel room, surrounded by the hollow echoes of his own lies. He had sought out youth and beauty, but he ended up with bankruptcy and loneliness. The stress of the lawsuits and the public shame finally caught up with Victor. He suffered a minor heart attack while sitting in a fast food restaurant. It wasn't fatal, but it was a wake-up call he couldn't ignore. He was 68, broke, and his body was failing him. He called me from the hospital bed, his voice weak and trembling. He expected me to rush over, to be the good wife one last time. He probably thought that my nurturing nature would kick in and I would forgive him. "Martha?" He wheezed into the phone. "I'm all alone here. The doctors say I need care. Please, for the sake of our 40 years. I listened to him breathe for a moment. I thought about the necklace he had unlatched from my neck. I thought about the divorce papers on my birthday cake. "I'll send a get-well card, Victor," I said quietly. "And I'll have a courier deliver it. But don't call this number again. I've already moved on." I hung up and felt a wave of relief. I wasn't his nurse, his mother, or his punching bag anymore. I was a woman with a full schedule and a bright future. Victor was eventually forced to move into a tiny, one-bedroom apartment in a rundown part of the city. It was a far cry from the mansion with the heated floors and the private chef. He had to learn how to cook for himself, how to do his own laundry, and how to live on a tiny monthly allowance from the state. He spent his days sitting in a plastic chair on a small balcony, watching people go by. He had become a ghost, a man that the world had moved past. Meanwhile, I was the most talked about woman in the city. I was on the cover of business magazines. I was invited to speak at universities. The Relic was now the most powerful woman in the industry, while the Titan was just a tired old man in a gray room. He would see my face on billboards and on the news, a constant reminder of everything he had thrown away. He had wanted younger, but he found out that younger doesn't mean loyal, and older doesn't mean weak. He was living in a prison of his own making, and the walls were closing in. A year passed since that fateful birthday. I stood in my garden, looking at the roses I had planted myself. I felt younger than I had at 50. My skin was glowing, my mind was sharp, and my heart was light. I realized that Victor's cruelty was actually the greatest gift he could have given me. If he hadn't been so overtly evil, I might have stayed in that stagnant marriage for another 20 years. I would have died a little bit every day, fading away in his shadow. His betrayal was the spark that lit the fire under me. It forced me to reclaim my name, my fortune, and my life. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving in a way I never thought possible. I realized that 65 wasn't the sunset of my life, it was the dawn of a new era. I had more energy, more passion, and more purpose than ever before. I looked at my reflection in the glass door and saw a woman who was beautiful because she was free. The lines around my eyes were no longer signs of age. They were maps of a journey that I'd finally won. We had one final meeting to sign the absolute last of the divorce and corporate settlement papers. It took place in a neutral law office. When Victor walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He was thin, his hair was unkempt, and his hands were shaking. He looked like he was 80, not 69. He sat across from me and wouldn't look me in the eye. He just stared at the table. The air of arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating sadness. I, on the other hand, felt energized. I had just come from a successful site visit for our new green energy plant. I signed the papers with a flourish, my signature bold and steady. Victor's signature was a jagged, messy scrawl. As the lawyers gathered the documents, the room was silent. The 40 years of our marriage were being officially erased with a few strokes of a pen. I felt a sense of closure that was deep and permanent. The man who tried to break me had only succeeded in breaking himself. I was ready to walk out of that room and never look back. Before I could leave, Victor whispered my name. The lawyer stepped out to give us a moment. "Martha," he said, his voice cracking. "I made a mistake. A horrible, stupid mistake. Sabrina, she never cared. No one cares. You were the only one who ever truly loved me. He looked up at me then, his eyes red and watery. He reached out a hand as if he expected me to take it. I'm drowning, Martha. I have nothing. Please, I'm still a good businessman. Give me a role, anything, just a chance to be near the company again, to be near you. He was begging. The Titan was on his knees, metaphorically and literally. He thought that by admitting he was wrong, he could crawl back into the life I had built. He still didn't get it. He thought his value was tied to my forgiveness. He didn't realize that my forgiveness was something he could never afford. He was looking for a lifeline, but I was the one who had finally learned how to swim without him. I looked down at him, and for a second, I remembered the young man I had met 40 years ago. But that memory didn't move me. It was just a picture of a person who didn't exist anymore. I leaned in close, so close he could see the lack of pity in my eyes. You told me I was too old for you, Victor, I whispered. And now I see the truth. You are far too poor for me. Not just in money, but in spirit. I reached into my purse and pulled out a $20 bill. I laid it on the table in front of him. Here. This is for your taxi back to that little apartment. Don't spend it all in one place. I stood up, smoothed my skirt, and walked toward the door. I didn't feel a sting of guilt. I felt a surge of power. I had given him 40 years of my life, and he had tried to take the rest. This $20 was the last thing he would ever get from the Vance estate. I walked out of the office with a steady stride, leaving him sitting there with his head in his hands. Victor sat in his dark, cramped apartment that night, the $20 bill still crumpled in his pocket. He turned on his small, flickering television, and there I was. I was being interviewed about my Silver Economy initiative, a program I started to help older women return to the workforce and start their own businesses. I looked radiant, confident, and incredibly happy. He watched as the interviewer asked me about my secret to success. I looked directly into the camera and said, I stopped letting people define my value based on my age. I realized that my experience is my greatest asset. Victor turned off the television. He sat in the dark for a long time. He realized then that he didn't just lose a wife or a house. He had lost the very architect of his existence. Without me to guide him, to fix his mistakes, and to provide the foundation, he was nothing. He was a man without a blueprint, living in a structure that was collapsing around him. He was truly, utterly alone, and the silence of his apartment was the only reply to his regrets. I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse, overlooking the city lights. The wind was cool, but I felt warm. I was 66 years old, and I had never felt more alive. I picked up a glass of champagne and looked at the moon. I thought back to my 65th birthday, to that moment of betrayal that had felt like the end of the world. It wasn't the end. It was the demolition that had to happen before the new, stronger building could be raised. I raised my glass to the empty air and whispered a quiet thank you to the man who had given me the one thing I didn't know I needed, my freedom. Then I thought of the interview, the interviewer's question, the whole city watching. And I thought of Victor sitting alone in the dark, the television off, the silence absolute. I set down my champagne and smiled. The same slow, calm smile I had given him on the night he tried to break me. He had called me too old. He had said he needed someone younger. Standing on that balcony, with the city spread out below me like everything I had ever built, I knew exactly what I hoped for him. I hoped he found someone his own age. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to hear more stories like this one. The next story is already waiting, and I promise you, you won't see the ending coming.